I walked into the Monday executive meeting with the calm of someone who had survived far worse than awkward presentations and delayed forecasts. 13 years inside this company had trained me to read silence the way engineers read logs. The air smelled the same as always: fresh coffee, polished wood, and the faint ozone hum from the servers running 2 floors below us. Nothing suggested this room was about to erase my role in a $2.7 billion empire I had helped build from nothing. I took my seat near the end of the table, opened my laptop, and waited. Caleb Roth, the founder and public face of Atlas Ridge Systems, sat at the head of the table. His hands were folded, no tablet, no slides. That alone was a warning. He glanced at his watch once, then twice, as if timing something only he had agreed to. When everyone settled, Caleb stood and smiled, the kind of smile reserved for investors, not for people who had spent years keeping the infrastructure alive. "Today," he said, "I'm proud to announce that starting this week, my nephew, Dylan Roth, will be stepping in as our new Chief Technology Officer." The room didn't move. It didn't breathe. Dylan, yes. That Dylan, 26 years old, 3 months in the company, a resume padded with consulting buzzwords, and exactly 0 production systems under his name. The door opened on cue. Dylan walked in like the room had been staged for him: tailored suit, rehearsed confidence, the posture of someone who had never watched a system fail at 3 in the morning. He shook hands, smiled broadly, and took the seat beside Caleb like it had always belonged to him. Caleb finally looked at me, just once, a brief nod, an apology disguised as inevitability. Dylan began to speak about vision, velocity, and reimagining the stack. Not a single metric, not one architecture diagram. When he described our core data pipeline, he got it wrong, confused it with something closer to a marketing automation tool. No one corrected him. I stayed silent, because sometimes silence isn't surrender. Sometimes it's the moment you stop fixing cracks and start watching who caused them. When the meeting ended, polite applause filled the room, fingertips only. No conviction. Back at my desk, I opened the codebase I had worked on the night before, and that's when I saw it. Dylan had already touched it, changed things he didn't understand. That was the first fracture, and systems never collapse all at once. They collapse one careless change at a time. How are you feeling right now? Did this moment hit closer than you expected? If it's been a while, take a second to remind yourself to schedule a routine health checkup. It's a small habit that matters. Where are you listening from today? If this story speaks to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. Because after that first crack, the real damage began quietly. The days after that meeting didn't explode into chaos. They thinned out instead, like a structure losing internal pressure without anyone noticing. People spoke softer. Conversations ended quicker. Meetings multiplied. But decisions grew strangely hollow. Dylan wasted no time making his presence felt. He scheduled back-to-back technical briefings, most of them heavy on slides and light on substance. He talked about modernizing legacy thinking while standing on systems that only existed because I had refused shortcuts for more than a decade. Every sentence sounded rehearsed, polished, and empty in exactly the same way. Engineers listened. No one argued. I noticed something else too. Dylan rarely asked questions. He gave instructions, long ones, confident ones, the kind you give when you don't realize what you don't know. One afternoon, he pulled me aside and showed me a status update he had already sent to the board. My work, my fixes, my optimizations from the previous week. His name at the top. He smiled while explaining how important it was for leadership to own the narrative. I smiled back, not because I agreed, but because I understood something clearly in that moment. This wasn't about technology. It never was. It was about image, about legacy, about bloodline looking competent under bright lights. Over the next 2 weeks, the system began to change in small, almost invisible ways. Testing windows shortened, documentation updates skipped, a few safeguards quietly removed, because they slowed things down. Dylan wanted speed, visibility, momentum. He talked about beating competitors to market, about how hesitation was the real risk. I watched the logs late at night, the way I always had. Patterns don't lie. And the patterns told me the same story every time we were trading stability for applause. One Friday afternoon, Dylan approved a deployment I knew wasn't ready. A major one. He insisted end-of-week launches were efficient low user activity, he said, like it was a universal truth instead of a gamble. I said nothing. By Monday morning, alerts began stacking like falling dominoes. Performance degradation, access failures, then something worse, unauthorized data queries in areas that had never been exposed before. I traced it back in minutes. A shortcut Dylan had approved, a line added to boost response time that bypassed a protection layer I had written years ago for exactly this reason. By noon, internal panic had replaced confidence. Dylan blamed legacy constraints. Caleb backed him publicly. Though his voice lacked conviction, the board asked for reassurances, not answers. That afternoon, I was called into a meeting, not to explain the failure, to step away temporarily, for the sake of optics. I listened, I nodded, I didn't argue, because by then, I understood the rule clearly. Truth wasn't dangerous here, timing was. I left the room quietly, and for the first time in 13 years, I stopped fixing the system. I started protecting the truth instead. Being asked to step away sounded gentle on paper. In reality, it felt like watching your name slowly erased from rooms you once held together. My calendar invites disappeared first. Then, access approvals started rerouting around me. Nothing dramatic, just enough to make it clear I was no longer expected to intervene. The system didn't collapse immediately. That's the lie people believe about failure, that it's loud. In truth, the most dangerous breakdowns arrive quietly, disguised as temporary instability. A few clients complained about latency. Support tickets doubled. Dylan dismissed them as transition noise. I stayed late anyway, not because anyone asked me to, but because I needed to understand exactly how much damage had already been done. I pulled logs from before and after the deployment. I matched timestamps, compared permission changes. Every shortcut told a story. And the story was consistent, safeguards removed, tests skipped, assumptions made instead of verified. One evening, while the office emptied out, I received a message from an old client contact. Short, careful, is Atlas Ridge still stable? We're seeing anomalies. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't care, but because anything I said would be used to reinforce the wrong narrative. I had learned that lesson too late once already. 2 days later, the board requested an internal review, not a technical audit, a messaging review. They wanted to align communication, reassure investors, and protect leadership continuity. Protect Dylan. In the meeting, numbers were discussed without context. Charts were shown without sources. When the security issue surfaced, it was reframed as a historical design limitation. That was the moment something in me finally settled. This wasn't confusion, it was strategy. After the meeting, I returned to my desk and did the one thing good engineers do when systems are being misrepresented. I archived everything, every version, every commit history, every access change tied to Dylan's approvals. I annotated timelines the way I used to annotate failures at 3 a.m, calm and exact. Truth doesn't need volume, it needs structure. That night, Caleb called me into his office. He looked older than I remembered, tired in a way that ambition can't fix. He spoke carefully, offered adjustments, a title revision, compensation, a promise that things would rebalance once the pressure eased. Then he said the part that ended everything. Hazel, I need you to support him until this stabilizes. I met his eyes. You mean I fix what he breaks? I said evenly, and let him take credit for stability. Caleb didn't answer. That was answer enough. I packed my bag that evening. Not dramatically, no announcement. Just the things that mattered: my notebook, an old access badge I never returned, and the quiet certainty that staying would mean participating in a lie. As I left the building, the servers hummed below me. Still holding for now. I knew they wouldn't forever. Systems don't forgive arrogance. They wait. This part has a detail that is easy to miss. Did you catch it? I didn't go home after leaving the building that night. Habit carried me to a quiet cafe a few blocks away. The kind with dim lights and no music loud enough to interrupt your thoughts. I opened my laptop, not to work, but to look. Sometimes you need distance to see what you were standing inside. Atlas Ridge Systems had been my life for 13 years. I had grown with it, aged with it, shaped it in ways no org chart ever reflected. But sitting there, watching reflections move across the window, I understood something painful and clarifying. I no longer belonged to that company. Belonging requires shared values, and somewhere along the way, ours had quietly diverged over the next week. I returned only to close loops. I answered messages, documented handovers, refused invitations to informal syncs that were nothing more than attempts to keep me tethered without authority. Dylan avoided me entirely now, not out of respect, out of fear. People who know they're standing on borrowed ground tend to. Late one afternoon, I noticed a change request approved under Dylan's name that made my stomach tighten. A core dependency rerouted, redundancy reduced. A single point of failure introduced where there had never been one. I flagged it, calmly, privately. The response came back 30 minutes later. Approved for efficiency, monitoring in place. Monitoring doesn't prevent collapse. It only documents it. That night, I finalized my exit. No press, no internal announcement, just a resignation letter sent directly to HR and the board. Precise and unembellished. I didn't accuse, I didn't threaten. I simply stated that I could no longer align my professional responsibility with the company's technical direction. The next morning, my access was reduced, not revoked, just narrowed. Enough to keep appearances intact, enough to make sure I couldn't interfere. I spent my final hours exporting my own work, not the company's property. But the frameworks I had personally authored before Atlas Ridge even had legal counsel. Patterns, principles, architectural notes. The thinking behind the system, not the system itself. No good engineer leaves without preserving the truth somewhere safe. Caleb didn't come see me. He sent an assistant instead. A polite goodbye, a rehearsed gratitude speech. I listened without responding. As I walked out, someone from the engineering team slipped a folded note into my hand. No name, just one line. You taught us that clean systems protect people. I folded it carefully and placed it in my pocket. Outside, the building looked the same: glass, steel, confidence. But I knew better now. I knew what happens when leadership mistakes speed for competence, lineage for skill. I didn't feel angry. I felt free. Because I understood something they didn't yet. I hadn't left the system. The system was about to reveal who had never understood it. I didn't take time off after leaving Atlas Ridge. I changed cities. Distance matters when you're trying to hear your own thoughts again. I chose a place that didn't ask who you used to be, only what you were building now. A smaller skyline, slower mornings, fewer rooms where people spoke in rehearsed certainty. I rented a modest office above a print shop. One desk, one chair, one server I bought secondhand. The fan louder than it had any right to be. It reminded me of the early days, when nothing worked unless you made it work yourself. That first week, I rebuilt nothing. I reviewed. I opened old notebooks, sketched architectures from memory, and rewrote principles I had learned the hard way. No shortcuts, no silent assumptions, no layers designed to impress investors instead of protect users. What I carried with me wasn't code, it was judgment. Messages began arriving quietly, former colleagues asking where I landed, old contacts checking in under the excuse of just catching up. I kept replies brief. I wasn't recruiting. I wasn't announcing anything. I was building privately. Then, one afternoon, an email came from an investment group that had once praised Atlas Ridge as best in class. They didn't mention the company by name. They mentioned instability, risk exposure, a loss of confidence. They asked if I was open to a conversation. We met in a glass conference room overlooking a river. No slides, no pitch deck. They asked how I would design a system if I were allowed to start clean. I told them the truth. I described a platform built for endurance, not speed. One where every safeguard existed because someone had already lived through its absence. I showed them logs from a small prototype I had been testing alone, nothing flashy, just stable. They didn't interrupt. At the end, one of them said, "You speak like someone who's had to live with the consequences." That's when I agreed to move forward. I named the company Quinn Systems, not for branding, for accountability. If it failed, my name would be on it. That mattered to me now. Within weeks, 2 former Atlas Ridge engineers reached out independently. Then a third. None asked about titles. They asked about standards, about whether testing still mattered, about whether speaking up would cost them their place. I answered honestly. We build things that hold. I said, and we don't pretend otherwise. Meanwhile, I watched Atlas Ridge from a distance. Another rushed deployment. Another internal memo reframing risk as growth friction. Dylan was still presenting, still confident, still mistaking silence for agreement. Clients began to notice. The thing about systems is this: you can ignore warnings, but your users can't. And when enough of them start asking the same question, narratives stop working. I didn't celebrate. I didn't comment. I kept building. Because by then, I understood the real shift hadn't happened when I left. It happened when the people who trusted the system began looking elsewhere. And soon, they would find me. This paragraph explains everything you are about to hear. The first real signal didn't come from the news. It came from a calendar invite. A former Atlas Ridge client, one of the quiet ones. The kind that never complained publicly, requested a technical consultation. No sales team, no executives, just engineers on both sides. They didn't ask me why I left. They asked me how quickly they could leave. Their system had stalled twice in 1 month. Minor outages, officially, but their internal dashboards told a harsher story, cascading delays, data sync errors, confidence eroding with every unexplained spike. Dylan's team blamed external load anomalies. The client's engineers didn't buy it. I walked them through a migration plan without drama. Risks first, timeline second. No promises I couldn't prove. They signed within a week. Then another followed. And another. None of them announced their departures loudly. Companies rarely do when they feel embarrassed for trusting the wrong stability. They just redirect traffic, quietly, decisively. By the end of the quarter, Quinn Systems wasn't large, but it was busy. We hired carefully. Every engineer went through the same conversation, not about speed, about responsibility, about what happens when you approve something you don't fully understand. Across the country, Atlas Ridge was still projecting confidence. Dylan appeared in interviews talking about temporary turbulence. He used words like recalibration and long-term vision. Caleb stood beside him, nodding. A man trying to protect both a company and a family name at the same time. But markets don't listen to interviews, they listen to numbers. The first earnings call after the outages was tense. Analysts asked sharper questions. Customer churn appeared in footnotes instead of headlines. Guidance softened. Just slightly, but enough. Internally, the pressure mounted. A former colleague called me late one night. No greeting, just exhaustion in his voice. They're rushing another release. He said, "Bigger this time." I didn't ask why. I already knew the pattern. Speed to regain confidence. Visibility to drown doubt. Another leap without a net. 2 weeks later, it happened. A full platform failure. Not hours, days. Data locked behind errors. No rollback could undo quickly. Support lines overwhelmed. Enterprise clients freezing operations while waiting for explanations that never fully arrived. This time, the narrative didn't hold. Anonymous engineers spoke. Logs leaked. Timelines didn't align with leadership statements. Dylan blamed legacy architecture again. But legacy doesn't approve new shortcuts. By the time the board convened an emergency session, the damage was measurable. Contracts paused, legal teams activated, regulators asking polite but pointed questions. I watched the headlines from my office, not with satisfaction, but with a strange calm. This wasn't revenge, it was gravity. Systems fall toward truth eventually, and when they do, they reveal exactly who built them and who only inherited the title. The call came late in the evening, after the headlines had settled into something heavier than speculation. Not frantic, not angry, just resigned. Caleb Roth's name lit up my phone. I let it ring longer than necessary, not out of spite, out of clarity. Some conversations shouldn't be rushed. When I answered, he didn't start with greetings. "Hazel," he said, voice low, stripped of the confidence that once filled conference halls. "I'm in your city." I already knew why. Atlas Ridge was unraveling faster than anyone had predicted. The board had suspended Dylan pending an internal review. Clients were demanding audits. Lawyers were rewriting language that should have never needed rewriting, and the market had stopped giving the benefit of doubt. "I need to see you," Caleb said. "Tomorrow morning." I didn't agree immediately. Finally. I told him where my office was. Small, unimpressive, honest. He arrived on time. Caleb looked older than I remembered, not just tired, but hollowed out by the slow realization that ambition doesn't shield you from consequence. He took in the room quietly, the single server rack, whiteboards filled with diagrams, engineers working without noise. "This is what you built?" he asked softly. "This is what I kept building," I replied. He sat across from me and didn't waste time pretending. "I was wrong," he said. "About Dylan. About replacing you. About believing the system could survive politics." I listened without responding. "I need you back," he continued. "The board is prepared to offer whatever it takes. Authority, equity, control." I folded my hands and met his eyes. "You already offered me everything once," I said, "right before you asked me to clean up someone else's mistakes quietly." Silence settled between us. Caleb exhaled. "He's my nephew, and I was your engineer." I said evenly, "For 13 years. That landed." He nodded slowly, the truth finally catching up to the weight he had been carrying. "If I had trusted competence instead of blood, you didn't." I interrupted gently. "And systems remember that." He looked down. When he spoke again, it wasn't as a founder. It was as a man watching his legacy collapse. "What happens now?" he asked. I stood and walked to the whiteboard, where a system diagram was half finished. "Now," I said, "Atlas Ridge will do what all systems do when their foundations are compromised. They'll either rebuild honestly, or they'll shrink until nothing important remains. And Quinn Systems?" I turned back to him. "Quinn Systems keeps running." Caleb stood. He didn't argue. He didn't negotiate. At the door. He paused. "I'm sorry I didn't protect you." I nodded, not forgiveness, not bitterness, just acknowledgement. After he left, my phone buzzed again. Another client. Another migration request. The center of gravity had shifted, and this time, there was no way to pretend it hadn't. Atlas Ridge didn't fall in a single headline. It unraveled in layers, the way institutions always do when truth starts moving faster than control. First came the press clarification, then the revised clarification, then silence. Within days, industry forums filled the gaps. Engineers spoke in careful language, but patterns emerged too clearly to ignore. Deployment timelines didn't match approval chains. Testing logs contradicted public statements. And somewhere inside those discrepancies sat a name the company tried not to repeat. Dylan Roth. The board announced his resignation by mutual agreement. No details, no apology, just distance. That alone told the market everything it needed to know. Clients didn't wait for official explanations. They never do, one by one. They paused renewals, invoked exit clauses, or quietly redirected workloads elsewhere. Some came to Quinn Systems. Others went to competitors. But no one stayed out of loyalty anymore. Loyalty requires trust, and trust, once broken, doesn't renegotiate. Caleb stepped down as chief executive 2 weeks later. The announcement was brief. He cited personal reasons, a desire to focus on family. The stock dipped, then stabilized at a lower truth. Atlas Ridge wasn't dead, but it was no longer an empire. It had become a case study. Meanwhile, Quinn Systems grew without spectacle. We didn't advertise. We didn't comment publicly. We focused on migrations, on stabilizing environments that had been shaken by decisions made far above the engineers who paid for them. One afternoon, I stood in our small server room watching status lights blink in steady rhythm. No alerts, no drama, just work holding the way it should. An engineer named Lila stood beside me. She had joined us after leaving Atlas Ridge during the second outage. "They're saying you destroyed him," she said quietly. I didn't turn around. "No," I replied. "I stopped covering for him." That distinction matters. Destruction implies intent. What happened to Atlas Ridge wasn't intent, it was exposure. Systems revealing the cost of arrogance, markets correcting false confidence. People realizing too late that competence isn't inherited. A few weeks later, a long-form article ran in a major industry publication. It dissected Atlas Ridge's rise and fall with surprising precision. Buried near the end was a line that made me pause. The original architecture, designed years earlier, proved resilient until leadership decisions compromised its safeguards. No name, no credit. I was fine with that. Recognition isn't the same as justice. Justice is quieter. It's watching your work endure while someone else's shortcuts expire on schedule. That evening, I received a message from a junior engineer still inside Atlas Ridge. "I finally understand why you always insisted on documenting everything." It read, "I wish we'd listened more." I replied with a single sentence. "Good systems teach even after you leave them." When I shut down my laptop, the city outside my window was alive and indifferent. Cars moved, lights changed, life continued without regard for fallen companies or rescued reputations. That's the thing about real consequences. They don't announce themselves, they simply arrive. After the collapse became public, the noise slowly faded. That's what always happens. Outrage burns hot, then exhausts itself. What's left is quieter and far more revealing. Atlas Ridge entered restructuring under a new interim board. Entire departments were merged or dissolved. Engineers who had once been buried under performative leadership were suddenly asked to document systems no one fully understood anymore. The architecture still existed, but the people who knew why it existed were gone. I didn't follow the updates closely. I didn't need to. The real aftermath arrived in smaller moments. A former senior manager emailed me to say he was starting over at a mid-sized firm. He wrote that the hardest part wasn't losing the prestige, it was realizing how much time he had spent defending decisions he never believed in. Another message came from a product lead who admitted she had known Dylan was unqualified, but stayed silent because it wasn't safe to be right. Silence has a cost. It just invoices later at Quinn Systems. We felt the contrast every day. Meetings were shorter, decisions slower, but cleaner. When someone didn't know something, they said so. When a release wasn't ready, it waited. No one tried to perform confidence. One morning, I received a request I didn't expect. A consulting firm asked if I would speak privately with a group of founders who had grown too fast. Not to audit code to talk about what happens when leadership choices outpace technical reality. I declined politely. I wasn't interested in becoming a cautionary speaker. My work was here. Still, I thought about Caleb sometimes, not with anger, with clarity. He had built something real once. He had also believed he could protect family without paying the price. That contradiction had finally resolved itself. As for Dylan, his name stopped appearing entirely. No interviews, no rebrand, just absence. That, too, was instructive. Careers built on image rarely survive prolonged silence. Late one evening, as I was reviewing logs, a junior engineer asked me why I never publicly told my side of the story. I considered the question carefully. Because systems don't need narrators. I said, they only need time. He nodded, unsure if he fully understood yet. He would. Outside, the city moved on. Companies rose. Others quietly diminished. The cycle continued without sentiment. I realized then that what I had taken back wasn't a company, or a title, or even a reputation. It was authorship. I was no longer maintaining someone else's legacy. I was writing my own line by line, decision by decision, without needing applause to confirm it mattered. And that, more than any downfall I witnessed, felt like the true conclusion. Almost. Some mornings, I arrive at the office before anyone else. Not because I need to, but because I like seeing a system wake up slowly. Screens light up, logs begin to scroll. Everything behaves the way it was designed to. Without ceremony, Quinn Systems never tried to replace Atlas Ridge. We didn't inherit its size, its press, or its mythology. We inherited something far more durable: trust from people who had learned what instability actually costs. I still think about the early days sometimes. The nights when I believed loyalty alone could protect good work. The meetings where silence felt safer than truth. Those lessons didn't disappear when Atlas Ridge fell. They stayed with me, sharpened, clarified. Caleb sent one final message months later. Short, personal, no requests. Just a sentence acknowledging that he finally understood what he had lost. Not a company, but a compass. I didn't reply. Not because I didn't care, but because some acknowledgments don't need echoes. As for me, I stopped measuring success the old way. I don't count how many people know my name. I count how many systems don't wake someone up at night. I don't chase growth for its own sake. I protect the integrity of the work and the people who rely on it. That's the part no one tells you about building something real. It doesn't roar, it hums. The empire I once built didn't fall because I pushed it. It fell because it forgot why it stood in the first place. And when that happens, stepping aside is often more powerful than fighting to stay inside. If there's one thing this journey gave back to me, it's this: you don't need revenge to restore balance. You need patience and the courage to stop fixing what refuses to be honest. Outside my office window, the city keeps moving. New companies rise, old ones fade. The cycle continues, indifferent and precise. Inside, the system holds, and for the first time in years, so do I. I didn't tell this story to prove I was right. I told it because many of us have stood quietly in places that forgot our value. How did this story make you feel as you listened? Calm, frustrated, or quietly understood? If you've ever lived through something similar, I'd love for you to share your own story in the comments. Where are you listening from right now? If this resonated, a like or share helps these stories reach the right people. And subscribing means you won't miss the next one. 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 Won't miss the next one.